She looked me straight in the eye, chin lifted, voice cold enough to cut. "You have no place here." I'd paid for every single piece of that wedding. The venue deposit, the caterer, the florist, the band, the dress, even the champagne currently chilling in silver buckets 40 feet from where she stood telling me I didn't belong. I didn't argue. I didn't remind her of the $63,000 I'd transferred across 4 separate payments over the past 8 months. I simply smiled, the way you smile at someone who's about to learn something important the hard way. "Understood," I said, and walked out of that reception hall while the final touches were still being arranged around us, string lights being tested, place cards being straightened, a wedding planner double-checking timing with the caterer. I sat in my car in the parking lot for exactly 4 minutes before making the first call. By the time the wedding party arrived that evening, dressed and photographed and glowing with anticipation, there was nothing left. No caterer setting up chafing dishes. No florist arranging centerpieces. No band unpacking equipment. No venue, actually, since even that reservation had somehow evaporated within hours. Just an empty room, and a bride standing in the doorway, finally understanding exactly what it costs to humiliate the person who's quietly making everything possible. My name is Corinne Ashworth, and the woman who told me I had no place at that wedding was my future daughter-in-law, Bianca, marrying my son Theo in what should have been one of the happiest days of my life. I want to explain something before I tell you the rest of this story, because I understand how this might sound from the outside, a mother-in-law wielding money as a weapon, punishing a young couple for wounded pride. That's not what this was. This was the final moment in a pattern I'd spent 8 months quietly absorbing, hoping, foolishly, that generosity might eventually earn the basic respect I'd never actually demanded. Theo was my only child, raised alone after his father left when Theo was 6, built through years of double shifts as a hospital administrator and careful financial planning that eventually allowed me to build a comfortable, stable life for both of us. I'd never remarried, pouring most of my energy into raising Theo and building a modest but successful career, eventually becoming a hospital's chief operations officer, a position that came with considerably more financial stability than either Theo or Bianca fully understood. When Theo proposed to Bianca 14 months ago, I'd been genuinely thrilled, welcoming her into our small family with a kind of enthusiasm that comes from finally having more than just the two of us. That enthusiasm, unfortunately, had never been reciprocated in quite the same way, though I'd spent months explaining away Bianca's coolness toward me as simple nervousness about becoming part of a new family. What I hadn't fully understood yet, agreeing enthusiastically to fund their entire wedding when Bianca's own parents explained they couldn't afford anything beyond a modest contribution, was exactly how completely that financial generosity would eventually be weaponized against me. The wedding planning process, from the very beginning, had unfolded with a particular pattern I'd initially dismissed as understandable stress. Bianca made every decision unilaterally, consulting me only when specific payments needed authorization, treating my financial contribution as an obligation owed to her rather than a genuine gift freely given. Small moments accumulated over those 8 months. Being excluded from the guest list discussions, despite personally knowing many of the family friends being invited. Being told, politely but firmly, that my opinion on venue selection wasn't really necessary since I was just handling logistics. Watching Bianca's mother, despite contributing significantly less financially, receive prominent inclusion in every planning decision, every dress fitting, every tasting appointment, while I received itemized invoices requiring payment. I'd mentioned this pattern to Theo once, carefully, not wanting to create unnecessary tension before his wedding. He'd seemed genuinely uncomfortable during that conversation, caught between loyalty to his mother and his desire to avoid conflict with his fiancée during an already stressful planning period. "She's just stressed," he'd said. "Once the wedding's over, things will settle down. She really does appreciate everything you're doing, Mom, even if she's not always great at showing it." I'd wanted to believe that explanation, genuinely hoping that whatever tension existed would resolve naturally once the actual wedding day arrived. Instead, that tension had culminated in Bianca's final, deliberate humiliation, delivered with calculated precision just hours before the ceremony, in front of the wedding planner and several vendors who happened to be present for final setup. "You have no place here," she'd said, loud enough for several people to hear clearly, a public declaration that apparently my financial contribution entitled me to nothing beyond writing checks. What Bianca hadn't fully considered, in that moment of casual cruelty, was exactly how much control I still maintained over every single vendor relationship I'd personally established and paid for throughout the entire planning process. Every vendor contract for that wedding had been signed by me, paid by me, and coordinated directly through my own accounts, a detail Bianca had never fully considered important since she treated my involvement as purely financial rather than logistically essential. The first call I made from my car was to Meredith Castelliano, the wedding planner I'd personally hired and paid directly, rather than through any joint account with Bianca or Theo. "Meredith," I said calmly, "I need you to cancel today's setup and release all vendor commitments immediately. I'm withdrawing my financial authorization for this event, effective right now." Meredith, professional but clearly startled, asked for confirmation given how close we were to the actual ceremony. "Mrs. Ashworth, we're 4 hours from the ceremony start time. Are you certain you want to proceed with cancellation at this point?" "I'm certain," I said. "Every contract has a clause allowing the paying party to cancel with immediate effect in cases of, and I'm quoting the language here, material breach of the working relationship. I believe being told I have no place at an event I've entirely funded qualifies." The second call went to the caterer, then the florist, then the string quartet I'd booked months earlier. Each conversation brief and professionally cordial, each vendor understanding immediately that their payment authorization had been formally withdrawn. I hadn't done this out of pure spite, though I understood how it might appear that way from the outside. I'd done it because I finally understood, watching Bianca's casual cruelty unfold in front of vendors and staff, that continuing to fund an event where I'd been explicitly told I had no place would only reinforce a pattern that needed to end, decisively, before it became the foundation of my entire relationship with my son's marriage. By the time the wedding party arrived that evening, dressed and photographed, glowing with anticipation for a celebration that no longer existed, I was already home, sitting quietly in my kitchen, waiting for the phone call I knew was inevitably coming. Theo called first, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Mom, what happened? Everything's gone. The venue says all the vendors cancelled. Bianca's hysterical. What's going on?" I explained calmly, without anger, exactly what had happened that afternoon. Bianca's public declaration that I had no place at the wedding, my subsequent decision to withdraw financial authorization from every vendor I'd personally contracted. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "She said that. In front of people." "In front of the wedding planner and at least 2 vendors setting up center for the reception," I confirmed. "I didn't cancel out of spite, Theo. I cancelled because I finally understood that continuing to fund an event where I'd been explicitly told I had no place would be accepting a role I'm not willing to accept anymore." "We can figure this out," Theo said, though his voice carried the exhaustion of someone realizing the scope of what needed figuring out. "Can you at least talk to Bianca? Maybe explain your side." "I'm happy to talk to Bianca," I said. "But this isn't really about explaining my side, Theo. This is about whether Bianca genuinely wants me to have a place in your marriage, or whether she simply wants access to my financial support while treating me as an inconvenience otherwise. Those are very different things, and I think tonight made clear which one has actually been happening." Bianca called an hour later, her earlier composure completely shattered, oscillating between apology and justification in a way that revealed more about her actual feelings than any careful, considered conversation might have. "I didn't mean it like that," she said. "I was stressed, I said something I shouldn't have, but you didn't have to destroy everything. Do you know how humiliating this is? Everyone knows what happened now." "I do know," I said quietly. "I imagine it feels similar to how I felt, standing in that reception hall, being told I had no place there, after 8 months of funding every single detail of your wedding." The wedding, once postponed and eventually rescheduled 2 months later, looked very different from the elaborate celebration Bianca had originally planned. Smaller, simpler, funded jointly by Theo and Bianca themselves alongside a modest contribution from her own parents, without any financial involvement from me at all. I attended, invited properly this time, treated with the basic respect I should have received from the beginning. Bianca never offered a full, unguarded apology, though she did acknowledge, carefully, that she'd handled things poorly during the original planning process, an admission that fell short of genuine accountability but represented more self-awareness than I'd expected given how our confrontation had unfolded. My relationship with Bianca remains cautious, built now on clearly established boundaries rather than the assumed, unearned closeness she'd expected simply because I was funding her wedding. I attend family gatherings, maintain a polite, functional relationship for Theo's sake, but I no longer extend the kind of unconditional generosity that had apparently allowed her to believe my presence and my financial support could be separated so easily. Theo and I had several difficult conversations in the months following that cancelled wedding, conversations that ultimately strengthened our relationship rather than damaging it, forcing him to more clearly understand and articulate his own boundaries within his marriage, rather than simply avoiding conflict by asking me to absorb whatever treatment Bianca decided to dispense. I don't regret those phone calls I made from my car that afternoon. I don't regret watching an elaborate celebration collapse entirely in the hours before it was supposed to begin. Some lessons, apparently, require losing something significant before people fully understand the actual value of what they've been taking for granted. So I'll ask you what I've asked myself since that day. If someone you'd supported generously suddenly told you that you had no place in their life, would you have continued giving anyway, hoping things might eventually improve? Or would you have finally, decisively, withdrawn support the way I did?